Handing over now to Adelaide's own Nathan Tedder, professor of the Belgian beer pub. Is that
Yeah, beer
your
sensei
title?
is what I think.
Beer
I was going
sensei.
for.
Thanks, Nathan.
Oh, yeah, do I? All right. You willing to hold it for me, or do I?
You put it on.
That's disappointing.
I'll give you a 5 at 15, and
Yep.
you've got 10 after that at 5.
Yeah. Once I work out how this thing works. Oh, good start.
Yeah, it's weird.
What the heck?
We got the other.
Oh, yeah. I got you. Is that roughly working? Oh, I need that on.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus, that's a frightening. Alrighty, as I think I've been introduced, I'm Nathan. And for my talk today, I'm bringing a paper we published in April entitled Sea Ice-Free Corridors for Antarctic, for large swell to reach Antarctic ice shelves. A couple of my co-authors around here, Luke Bennett and Rob Massam. Hi, also Phil is somewhere in the world. But so looking at some just background for this, I had the clicker as well. So firstly, sea ice. So because we're looking at periods when ice shelf sea ice free, what's happening with sea ice and general trends. So we just kind of see a retreat season between September to February and an advanced season from February to September. Yeah, we are. Okay, we got this. In terms of what's changed over the past 40 years, it went for, geez, too many things, man. So they went for about a sea ice extent increase of about 1.6 all throughout the Antarctic continent. However, that was kind of truncated by a decrease in the west. So the Bellingshausen and then Musen Sea, which end up decreasing. And then afterwards, once you get 2016, 2019, I think this was kind of shown in Pat's image a little bit earlier that sea ice really just begun to decrease and decrease heavily. So you saw that sea ice didn't really go into about a record low 2017. Seems like 2022 is going to be about similar levels. So kind of brings this into play a little bit more. The other side is swell. So ocean swells are pretty much surface gravity waves, which are no longer influenced by the wind. So let's say you've had a storm come through and create them, and will carry a little bit larger amplitudes. For the Southern Ocean, this is a pretty high energy wave, high energy ocean. And about the averages for summer is about 4 meters and then 5 meters in winter. As you can see in the image on the right from Young, it's not consistent all the way through. There are going to be some areas, let's say 30 degrees to about 120 degrees east, which are generally higher in energy, and 300, 330, which were weaker because you've got the blocking from South America. And then over this last 40 years in the study, there was also this trend, especially in the 90th percentile, where significant wave heights really increased. So about a 0.25% per annum trend. So kind of linking, and Southern Ocean, so kind of linking this all together to where this, yeah, it worked good. I'm just going to use the computer. I can't handle the clicker. So where this all kind of links in is why we care about all these things together is that when you lose sea ice, especially localized around an ice shelf, that'll allow it to be exposed to swell. And this can, once you get swell coming in, it can come in and implode your implore effectual strains, riff it, carve it, weaken it, retreat it, and eventually, if you get this, especially when combined with other factors such as melt pooling, atmospheric rivers, and hydrofracture, you can potentially get disintegration events. I mean, the last one being the one I got the image of is probably the most famous one of all of them kind of combined together to a really destructive event, but there are also others that have occurred. So we know swell is important. And one thing is, okay, so we know it's important, and really the gap we were kind of looking at is how do you get wave information around a coastline that's relevant. So we created, we created the corridor algorithm. So really designed this question. So an example of the problem we're solving is on the image up there to show that I'm not willing to fully give up the technology. And then how we did this was through, firstly we defined these corridors as through a sea ice-free section of the ocean that a wave can propagate through directly without being attenuated. So in this case, for the Retha, you can kind of see the pathway. Taking out a little, firstly data choices. So before we did this, we made a few decisions data-wise. Firstly, sea ice concentration, we just got it from a passive microwave data set. So the Nimbus 7 satellite stuff that's been around for about 40 odd years. So again, so we're using 1979, we chose about 2019, and pretty standard 25 kilometer grid resolution. And it did have 2 days prior to August 1987, which we have corrected to 1 day to make sure everything's nice and consistent. The first real decision we had though was landmass. So this data is treated. So there are parts of it that the data set itself removed. So we have kind of stuck with that GFSE 25S landmass. However, that doesn't come with ice shelf locations. So to get that in there and really get the ice shelf edges going, we use the measures ant-bound toolbox to get latitude longitudes and then just manually plotted out where the coastline edges were. And that was stored in a data set somewhere on our map on the code I created. So the other side was swell, and we used the Gawker wave finecast. So this is a CSIRO bomb product, really, really good. Uses WaveWatch 3 for reanalysis from buoy data and all that. Same thing, 1979 to now for data ranges, which is really convenient. 40 kilometer spatial grid, which is also quite fantastic. So in terms of it, it does get converted to make them all mesh together, but 40 does make life a bit easier than, let's say, 100. Hourly frequency, which has been converted up to daily, so everything's in that side. And it does have a check for sea ice concentration, so it will get rid of data after a certain point, around 75 degrees south, 75%. And has a kind of correction at 25 to 75%. This probably won't impact too much, but it is there. And then finally, years, when I talk about it, it is that September to August period. So we really want to capture the summer. So, don't want your events being kind of cut off in half. So kind of get around that. And once we get to creating this algorithm, so firstly, the first step was working out what part of the shelf was exposed. And we took a little project that Rob and Phil made about a similar time, the coastal exposure, and pretty much co-opted that into our little ice shelf model. So we defined that edge line and parts that were exposed. And this worked in a two-way, like pretty much a two-step thing. So firstly, it would check adjacent cells on that Cartesian grid of if it is kind of meeting the sea ice condition of under or less than or equal to 15%, which is a standard error margin. And then once it found that, it would then run a bucket fill level algorithm, which would just continue on to keep checking cells around it until either it ran out of cells before it hit sea ice everywhere, or reached the threshold of about, we used 5 million square kilometers because we found that was pretty reliable for getting rid of every polynya. If it did that, it was considered ocean, went to the next step. If it ran out of cells, we just ditched it. It's under a polynya. So then once we had that nice little coastal exposure algorithm, we then brought it into corridors. So the next step was building this algorithm out so we can actually get areas we want to extract. How this one goes is we know the areas we know the points in the cells that are exposed. Every point on the boundary. And then you just calculate a slope between that point and a point in the boundary. Put that slope line down to individual steps, and then just take every cell on that step until either it hits sea ice or land, or eventually somehow gets to the boundary and is completely free of it. It does have a little also kind of grace period, about 5 or so cells, just to make sure finer angles can get through, because sometimes geometry can get quite weird. So we have kind of factored that in so we don't just miss parts of the ocean that were just weirdly placed. And then once you got everything to run through, it takes the union, and we pretty much keep everything. You've got I put 2 examples here. I'm going to break the clicker again. Firstly, the Risa, my little pet one, that was a pretty more simple standard where you had the idealized kind of sea ice on either side, and you had the ocean kind of punching through. And Larsen C, where it's a lot more complicated. You've got the coastline getting in the way. You've got icebergs getting in the way as well, but also some of them don't actually reach that 15% threshold, so it can punch through. And then once we get through that, we opted to normalize everything against its maximum. So just whatever corridor we could take at 100% sea ice. So every part of the ocean that was possible. And we normalize that, and also duration, make sure it's nice and consistent. And then we also incorporated a 57.5 degrees south cutoff. So not to run it all the way to, there's no point really taking equatorial waves in this one. So kind of kept it at least consistent around Antarctica as a bit of a boundary. 57.5 was chosen because South Georgia also got in the way and sometimes would produce sea ice in summer, and that would blow it out to like 53 degrees and if we're running on max sea ice. So it was a nice little fun additional thing. Once done, you get a nice, it would just go into Corker, pretty much rip out those locations, put it in Corker, take out the, in this case would be just the significant wave height. And we just use that as a proxy for wave energy because it's a decent one and it kept it nice and simple for this study. You can see an example here. We got a nice 5-6 meter swell going about there-ish. Then we applied just a crude directional filter to get rid of everything that was flowing away from the shelf. So just put a couple of directions, which should give a nice range for direct going in. And then just extracted the maximum significant wave height for each day. So looking more towards results that we ended up getting. So the image on the right is some key shelves around Antarctica. Gray is duration. And then black is the maximum area we got at any single point of that year. Light blue is shaded areas or areas where sea ice is rather consistently forming in summer. So about 80% of the time, summer, autumn. And what we kind of found is as much as you had that kind of systematic loss in the west, increase in the east sea ice, most of these individual ice shelves were really driven by localized factors. A good example of that would be, let's say, the Mertz and Cook. As we saw from Rob's talk yesterday, you have a nice ice tongue in the Mertz, and that would create, and on top of having fast ice, it also created an iceberg trap, which allowed a lot of sea ice to form around the Cook and actually would protect it from a lot of swell energy coming in. You got examples, for instance, the Larsen B has the Antarctic Peninsula will act as a similar thing and keep it insulated from swell most years. Of course, there's one example of 2002, which, wrecked up the place, but till then, other things like Polynias, so the Ross will cut off a lot earlier than most shelves, and bays as well will kind of impact. However, despite all those localized, we did have an average trend of it would be around late December to mid-April would be when these seasons really came in, which is a bit of a lag from the sea ice retreat and advanced seasons. So about 2 months, which is expected because sea ice will just take a little bit of time to retreat to the point an ice shelf is exposed. Even when sea ice growing, it will take a bit of time for it to shut off a shelf from swell energy. And then ultimately, when it came to range, so what an average season would look like, it was anywhere between about 0 to 208 days. 0, depending on the shelf, is quite common. Some shelves can have years without being exposed. 208 days under no circumstances common. That was the Wilkins in 2008 and coincided with one of its disintegration events, or multiple actually. Wilkins is weird, but beyond that though, you'd have another one, the Larsen C. That 1 year that it dropped off was in the 120, 130 day range when the Larsen B went. Even though you couldn't have that, there were also shelves that couldn't be exposed for hundreds of days, let's say Thimble, for instance, and it just hasn't really gone. So there's probably another process there that some shelves are able to withstand wave energy more efficiently than others. In terms of area, the other thing that really came from this was, as much as you do have that exposure, you still have a sea ice barrier of some kind. You will still have some level of protection from swell coming in from certain directions, because in terms of the mean maximum per year was around 0 to 0.6. So there's still some influence as much as you have that pathway. So the other thing was trends. So we kind of took about 69 ice shelves in this study using about anything around over 500 square kilometers and kind of separated them east and west. We included the Antarctic Peninsula in the west just to kind of, didn't make sense to have it separate. Got 5. Cool. I think I only need 5. 6 if we had more technical issues. And then, yeah, so in this case, what we ended up doing, so in these trends overall, we kind of had a bit of a contrast. So area kind of did what you expected. As time went on, because you had that increase in a period where sea ice extent was increasing, for most of it ended up decreasing. That kind of followed. It's nice when they follow the literature. Duration, on the other hand, increased somehow. So the seasons got longer. And this could be a case of the West just coming online, having a little bit more of an impact and overpowering the East in this sense. And yeah, that was underlined. So in an individual sense, the top image is a climatology of 8 shelves we picked, 4 in the East, 4 in the West. and their average wave heights coming in. So in this case, it is factoring in years that these don't occur. So a shelf that is, let's say, pretty low, a Totten, for instance, that low has kind of been driven by the fact that not every year it's exposed. So just to kind of give an impression of what's the average wave energy coming in. So for this one, generally in terms of the largest impact, it was between February to March. But as you can see that depending on the shelves, for instance, the Wilkins could take all the way to June, July before it would shut off, or the Larsen C would open up in November. So, again, shelf dependent, but generally February and March was really the kind of rule of thumb that would work. Looking towards what we defined as large wave days. So we wanted kind of a measure for which days had the most swell coming in and highest energy. So we took about 6 meters as our cutoff for it. We kind of saw for the east that the thimble really drove it. So, it kind of makes sense. It was the shelf that was the most exposed. You've got kind of a longer range of time than the others, but still decently, other shelves in certain years could really match it. So such as Shackleton, Cook, whereas the West was really driven by the Wilkins. That this shelf really just attracted, and it makes sense considering its corridors tended to run later on, especially into that autumn May period where the Southern Ocean's getting more active and more energetic, and it was kind of picking that up a bit. Finally, in trends, and this kind of ended up becoming a thing that when you compare the East and West, so the colored bars are large wave days, so periods per 6 days per shelf per year. And the kind of arrow bar line is just duration, so it's how much stays it was having. Kind of saw that over time that eventually that there was almost a regime shift. So at the start, the East was really dominant for this energy. The West barely was a player, and then as time went on, it kind of evened up, and then the West took over. But you also kind of see this kind of thing where it doesn't perfectly follow duration. There are some years where you get a lot of wave energy, but on relatively lower duration. Some years where a lot of shelves are exposed for a long period of time without really kind of getting that wave energy coming in. So there's a bit of luck or randomness to this as well. The storm surge can come in and take 6 days of large waves for about a 15-day period, or you could have 90 days without it. Kind of most likely reflects in this. But ultimately, changes in the Southern Ocean are probably also influencing that larger wave energies became more common as time went on, especially as the West, as you can kind of see that it's getting more bang for its buck on less durations per shelf. And yeah, in summary, just to quickly go through this. So we've made an algorithm, we did a code, it told us how frequent ice shelf exposure is and relative wave energy and wave conditions for it. Average season for corridors, this was late December to mid-April, and then peak period swells, February to March. Declining corridor area, but it kind of truncated against the wave seasons, and large waves became more common for shelves in the West. Oh, thank you for listening. All right. We need to go back to the 60s. I can't handle this tech.
Any questions for Nathan from the room?
Hi, it's Mike Malin. This is maybe a slightly tangential question, but
sure.
What's the proof that waves really affect the role they play in calving? Is that still debated? And do we know how big the waves have to be to cause it?
We don't really know how big the waves need to be. It could just, I don't think it's as debated that it can happen because the massive, it's kind of just with it. I think it's just more, there's a lot of things that can happen that could take it out. But I think in terms of wave energy, it could really just be as long as it's available. But I think it's more shelf dependent, thickness dependent than anything else. So, we're kind of looking at the Wilkins, for instance, as a secondary, just to go tangential. And Jordan, I think, will show a little bit of this, not to spoil. Oh, yeah, 100%. But yeah, I think we found that even pretty decently low significant wave heights were getting good strains on a decently thin shelf. So don't know how well that answers that question, but we at least gave Jordan a layup.
Got one from Rob here.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Nathan. just in answer to Mike's question there, I'm sorry, Jordan, I won't go on too much, but I think what we were looking at with the Larsen, where we sort of thought this may be a trigger event, you know, there was exposure over a number of years, but I think the story was that the wave energy was attenuated quite close to the ice shelf front, but it was the damaged nature of the ice shelf front which was the key factor. And, you know, there was a lot of rifting there due to glaciological imperfections. And one of the arguments that we put forward as well was this rifting went all the way through, but there was basal rifting, in other words, as well. So it was the concentration of wave energy on that outer margin that was, you know, over a number of years, it eventually gave way, and that triggered the release of damaged, melted ice behind, you know, that was hydrofractured, et cetera, et cetera. So, but very much still open. It's an interpretation, absolutely right.
Any other questions? Yes, Jordan. Okay, go for it on the chat. Ellie, feel free to ask directly.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for your presentation. I just had one question, and it was about, well, if I'm not mistaken, you use your corridor in order to calculate the number of days the ice shelves are exposed to waves, right?
Yep.
So I was wondering, what about the waves that propagate into the ice? Because long swell are the less attenuated waves in the ice, so they might have an influence too.
They probably will. However, we've tried to avoid that as much as we could with this. So, I mean, that adds more complication, but it might be doable one day. But I assume there's some level of, we need to add a model to it and, you know, get someone with really good math skills. I'm going to point to Jordan again. You know, may as well keep signing him up for things. But yeah, that's something we could do in the future. So
great, thanks.
No problem.
Time for one more quick one. Okay, I've got one. So you're looking at corridors with no sea ice from the open ocean to ice shelves.
Yep.
I wonder if there's also a warm atmosphere correlation with those kind of events too. And I wonder if you could pretty easily look at ice shelf melt from remote sensing to see if there's a cross correlation between days of corridor and days of ice shelf melt. Something to think about.
I think this is doable. I think I've had a brief thought about it. I think there was a paper on something similar.
There's a couple of daily products you could use for that quite easily. I think
one of the Japanese research groups had something similar last year, not like just when sea ice was lost, not anything pretty kick there. So I think it's doable.
Okay, great.
So I'm confident.